Ladies and gentlemen, if we can begin. My name is Tom Axworthy. I'm Public Policy Chair here at Massey College, and I want to welcome you, all of you who have braved this amazing Toronto storm to come and discuss the even greater storm, which is gusting in from the south. But we're delighted you're here, and we're delighted for our online audience. We've got a very packed day, and so we will begin with introductions of our opening speaker and the land acknowledgement. I did want to say that some of you here and some of you online will have participated in the conference we organized last year, which was called What's Next? We did it on the day of Mr. Trump's inauguration. And I'm happy to say that our partners from that event a year ago, January, the Canadian International Council, the Bill Graham Centre for International Contemporary History, Canada's the NATO Association of Canada, have joined with us again for this second follow-up conference. And it's probably fair to say that however far out or even extreme the predictions were last January on what might unfold, they've all been exceeded. and therefore, we are assessing again this changed America and how Canada and the world responds to it. So I'd like to begin by inviting Arvin Christianhold, who's one of our junior fellows here at Massey College and a key part of our planning committee for the public policy program. He's helped us with all our events. And more particularly, he and his colleagues, junior fellows at Monk and Massey, are planning our next conference in the public policy program at the end of March on affordability, which is only next to Mr. Trump, one of the most important issues in Canada. So kudos to our students for taking up that initiative. So please come and welcome our opening speaker.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome to Massey College on behalf of the Junior Fellow community. We would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered and which the University of Toronto operates on. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be gathered here today and discuss pertinent topics that touch on the central values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our principal, Dr. James Orbinski. Principal Orbinski brings a lifetime commitment to civility and leadership toward the public good to Massey College. As a medical doctor, humanitarian practitioner, an advocate, he believes in actively engaging and shaping our world so that it is a more just, fair, and humane place. Providing medical humanitarian relief worldwide in situations of war, famine, epidemic disease, and genocide, Dr. Orbinski also served as International Council President and accepted the 1999 Nobel Peace Prize on their behalf. He was the founding director of York University's Dadala Institute for Global Health Research, co-founder of Dignitas International, and co-chaired the founding and startup of the globally successful not-for-profit organization Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, awarded for a lifetime of leadership in global health and humanitarianism. He received Canada's Meritorious Service Cross for his leadership in providing direct medical relief in Kigali during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. I would also like to add that Dr. Orbinski has been a very proud and strong supporter of the public policy program here at Massey College, and has encouraged junior fellows such as myself to be part of a number of important initiatives dedicated to serving the public good. Please join me in welcoming Principal Urbanski.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Arvin, for the introduction. Yes, it's been a wild and stormy weekend, but it's been an even wilder and stormier year for the international system and for all of us, most especially here in Canada, given the reality of what is now a predator state on our southern border. And the ongoing reality of a quiescent but increasingly bellicose predator state on our northern frontier. But most especially, it has been an extremely troubling, difficult, and a painful year for literally millions of people who have suffered the consequences of some major changes internationally, and most especially changes in American support for the multilateral system. I've been asked to say a couple of words about that system, but before I do, let me just thank Tom and Peter. Peter Slowly, where are you, Peter? And Peter, for not only organizing this particular deeply timely event, but for an ongoing commitment to public policy here at Massey, and always in partnership with our fellow organizations like the Bill Graham Centre, Trinity College, the NATO Association of Canada, and the Canadian International Council. We have a stellar program for the day, and again, that is in full thanks to the incredible commitment and dedication of Tom and Peter, working very closely with our junior fellows and working very closely with our partners. And again, I just want to say a deep and sincere thank you to Tom and to Peter. So Mark Carney is absolutely right. This is a moment of rupture. It's not a transition. It's not a blip in the increasing and ongoing fragmentation of the international order. It is absolutely a moment of rupture. The global tariffs have certainly had a major impact on every single nation in the world, certainly here in Canada. The average tariff percent is 10% on every nation in the world, and that's an average. India is 50%. Canada, we actually thus far have done quite well. Ours is around 3.9% in actual reality. But with CUSMA on the table in the coming months, and with the rhetoric, or as I will say, not actually rhetoric, the threat, the very real threat that Donald Trump poses to Canada, and his threat of imposing 100% tariffs on Canada should we make a deal with China. This is really stark and has profound domestic impacts. We're already sitting at a place where there are about 2.2 million users of food banks here in Canada every month. Food costs have gone up by 60% in the last 5 years alone. There is a growing inequity and income gap for Canadians across the country. And with the looming possibility of even greater job losses if negotiations for the CUSMA agreement fail, we are looking at millions of Canadians who will be either out of work or will be profoundly pushed even further to the margins of our society and of their economic reality within our society. The fact is that kind of precarity that we experience and that our Prime Minister domestically has to focus on That precarity exists now around the world, or is exacerbated now around the world. And so this is the new economic reality. But the reality too, the even greater reality of the last year and the impacts of the Trump administration on our multilateral system means very clearly that, in my mind, as I will now describe it, the myth and the welcome myth of the international liberal order, that myth is over. We have, since roughly 1990, we have experienced a kind of a fragmenting, reshaping drift of the international order. And that really is since the end of the Cold War and the emergence of American hyperpower. It has been an age, really, from then, 1990, the end of the Cold War, to now, really a period of declining U.S. hyperpower and declining actual authority and in their hegemonic system, as China has risen in its economic power, as China has risen in its own regional imperial ambitions and global imperial ambitions. And all that in the context of the ever-present Russian military reality and its refusal since 1990 to defer or to accept the reality of American hegemony. Our international system has shape-shifted over that period right through to the international financial crisis in 2008. And then from there, it's even fragmented even more. Over that period of time, there has been very significant underfunding of the UN-based system and of the multilateral institutions that have been and that still remain part of that system. But the myth remained. And the myth, as I very gently tried to explain to a group of my 17-year-old daughter's friends who were at the house over the weekend, I tried to explain that in very simple but not simplistic terms, I tried to explain that the international order emerged post-1945 and was really committed to three core concepts. One is the pursuit of the good. And that was very much in the face of World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, and the massive destruction, particularly, that was wrought during World War II. From that came a commitment to recognize that we need a system that in principle pursues the good, and that we need a system, the second principle, that does so not through military power. The experience of totalitarian power and the military power that wrought from Russia and from Germany, and also the militaristic authoritarianism, if you want to call it that, of Japan, the military power and the impact of the use of that power around the world was profound. And it was very clearly recognized that we need another system, we need another way of doing things, of getting things done. And that was not through the use of military force, but it was through, consensus building, through cooperation, and through building gradually an architecture whereby a rules-based system for decision-making and for determination of public goods and for actions around those public goods, that a rules-based system was necessary and that it could work. And the third principle for the international order, as I see it, was that it was committed to the right use of force. And there's many ways of describing that, but I won't go into it in great detail. I'm not in any way saying that that system that in principle pursued the good, that was rules-based, and that attempted to use the right or engage the right use of force. That system was deeply imperfect, deeply flawed in many ways, and most especially when one looks at, for example, the veto of the Security Council. But for the first time in human history, and I really mean that, for the first time in human history, we, the collective we, as human beings, organized ourselves to create a governance system where at least the concept of a public good could emerge and could be discussed, debated, and pursued. And since 1945, that essentially has been the great focus of the international system. And it has been a focus that has yielded very, very significant and positive results. We've seen massive declines in under 5 mortality. We've seen massive increases in maternal health. We've seen massive movements of people out of poverty and into a state of at least hopeful precarity, as opposed to despairing circumstances that the majority of the world's poor lived in pre-1945. We've also seen that system has prevented great power war since 1945. We've seen more than 70 peacekeeping missions, near eradication of smallpox and other major disease control. We've seen massive expansion of human rights law. We've seen the establishment of a very powerful, not always effective, but very powerful international trade system from GATT to the World Trade Organization. And we've seen major accomplishments in international agreements and treaties around public goods. And for example, the agreement on the ozone layer, the new alterations to the Geneva Conventions and the revised protocols, the Convention on the prevention of the use of landmines in war, and most especially and most significantly, the Paris Agreement. And for all of its failures, and there are many, it's quite important to recognize that it took 25 years from 1992 through to the early 2000s to actually reach that agreement. Now that agreement and that period of time is a remarkably short time in the scope of human history and in the scope of our ability to actually understand and take material actions, or at least commit to material actions, to deal with the major challenge of the global commons. I can go into that in more detail in the Q&A if people are interested. But those are major, major accomplishments. There are also major failures, and I think we're all familiar with them in terms of the wrong use of power, the wrong use of coercive soft power, and so on and so on. Now, part of that international system is a system dedicated to global health and humanitarianism. And the WHO is at the center of that system, the very, very center of that system. And that system, that multilateral system that focuses on global health and humanitarianism includes UNICEF, UNHCR, OCHA, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the World Food Program, and the FAO. And as I said, those, for example, among a broader range of multilateral institutions, or UN-based multilateral institutions, have really shaped global standards, treaties, and collective problem-solving mechanisms around critical problems of the global commons. And again, deeply imperfect, but still very significant accomplishments for the first time in human history. And I think that really is, we have to really remember that and really absorb what that means. And when I say for the first time in human history, as I said a moment ago, I actually mean those exact words. This is a huge accomplishment in our human story. And myths are part of how human beings imagine themselves. And they're the myth, if you will, of the international liberal order has actually helped us achieve some very great things. And most significantly, it's helped us achieve or avoid, for 85 years, major, major war or a World War III. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that myths are stories. They're stories that we tell ourselves, There's stories that we create. There's stories that we see ourselves in, that we choose ourselves in, and that we make ourselves in. And I've given a little bit of detail around what that story of the international liberal order, what that story has allowed us to do. But that story is now over, and we need a new story. What that story will be, it is for us to actually create and understand. It's quite important that we recognize the impacts of some of the cuts and some of the changes that the Trump administration has wrought. And I'm just going to focus on global health and very specifically on the material aspects of global health. 1 year ago today, Donald Trump withdrew the United States, or announced the withdrawal of the United States from the WHO. 1 year ago today, he announced the radical cuts in U.S. foreign aid, and most especially the cessation of funding through USAID, which is the premier American humanitarian assistance support organization. It's also part of the reality that the United States has been the single most important funder of the international system since its creation. USAID and American global assistance for humanitarian and global health action accounted in 2024 for 40% of all spending in global health and humanitarianism globally. 40%. Now imagine that just being cut. Well, that's what happened. Now, what are the impacts? Well, there are immediate material impacts. In the last year, the last 12 months, the most rigorous estimates and the most conservative estimates are that 650,000 people have died as a consequence of that in the global south, and most especially around global AIDS, TB, and malaria treatment, containment, and control programs, and also in maternal child health programs and in many other programs. I'm just going to focus for a moment on AIDS, TB, and malaria. 170,000 people, conservatively, have been estimated to have died in the last 12 months because of cuts to antiretroviral therapy for HIV. 48,000 people have died of tuberculosis, a fully treatable disease, curable disease that costs between $20 and $40 per year per cure for that particular disease. When you cut funding for the drugs, there is absolutely not a hope in hell that a person is going to survive tuberculosis. For $20 to $40, you can treat and not only ameliorate, but you can cure tuberculosis. 48,000 people are now dead, and in 4 years, the estimate is that that number may rise to 2.2 million. In fact, will very likely rise to 2.2 million. About 160,000 children have died of pneumonia, another treatable disease. 150,000 have died from malnutrition. 125,000 have died from diarrhea. And 70,000 children have died from malaria. All of those diseases are either fully treatable or curable. 650,000 people in the last 12 months alone because of cuts to USAID. And estimates, and very conservative estimates, are that within 4 years, globally, 22 million people will die because of the cuts to USAID funding. Now that is just enormous. And what strikes me the most quite apart from the actual impact on people's lives and on programs, health systems, and so on, what strikes me the most is the coldness, the callousness, and the capricious use of power with which these cuts were implemented. Complete disregard for any sense of the good, any sense of our collective responsibility for each other, and in complete, even from a realist IR, international relations perspective, a complete disregard for a standard public health principle that says, essentially, and this is my version of it, it is wise self-interest to be concerned with the welfare of others. So if I'm concerned for others, I'm actually creating causes and conditions and circumstances in public health infrastructure, infectious disease containment and control and so on, that has an immediate impact on the prevention of my, or the reduction of my vulnerability to those very things. So the system that has been broken is that system. And it's been replaced but with a transactional, power-based, deeply self-interested, and profoundly short-sighted approach to global health and humanitarianism. And the same is true when we think about international humanitarian law in war or in situations of extreme social distress. The United States has been a key actor in promoting adherence to international humanitarian law and to advancing human rights. I'm not in any way suggesting it has been a perfect actor, and I'm not in any way suggesting that its actions have always been completely altruistic, very rarely so. But even in its assertions and its support for international humanitarian law and the advancement of human rights, that has in some ways been guided by the same public health principle. It's wise self-interest to ensure or to be concerned with the application of international humanitarian law and the pursuit of human rights. So the same kind of concept applies there as well as to actual practical global health programs. But what's happened, even in the face of the fact that different American administrations have taken slightly varying approaches to different priorities and agendas over time when it comes to global health, what we're seeing now is a turn, not only a turn, but a tearing and a breaking of a relationship to the kind of principles and practices that I've just described. Providing basic humanitarian care, fighting epidemics, malnutrition, and vaccine-presentable diseases, and supporting the world's most marginalized people, that these are worthy causes is no longer part of the equation. That these are not only morally worthy causes, but materially beneficial should one engage in ameliorating those circumstances. This is off the table. What we have now is an America First global health strategy. But before I talk about that, I just want to say as well that in addition to a reduction in material support for programs, we also, the change or the break, the abruption, the tear, has also meant a withdrawal of American leadership in science, in defining public goods from a critical problem-solving perspective, which is the typically American way of thinking about things, which is not a bad thing, by the way. And it's also meant that institutions like the WHO, which have been the center of the global health and humanitarian structure, that these have been all but emasculated, frankly. Leadership from the Americans over the last 40 years, for sure, but also over the last 85 years, leadership over the last 40 years has meant profound engagement by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, which brings incredible scientific expertise, incredible epidemiologic expertise to global health. Withdrawal of the Fogarty Institute, which has trained 8,500 scientists around the world that have worked hand in hand with CDC scientists, 1,700 of which were around the world, right, in 2024. All that's gone. American leadership created PEPFAR, Gavi, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and there's many, many more that I could describe. Those are the main ones, and those are the ones that have had the most profound impact on creating new solutions, new policies, procedures, practices, healthcare technologies like vaccines, new drugs for AIDS, TB, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and so on and so on. All that is gone. And with that, remember, you can turn a switch that turns it off, but you can't just turn a switch and turn it on. Once you turn it off, it dissipates. When you want to rebuild that, it's not just money and short-term goal setting. Well, let's just start it again. That will take at least a generation, 30 years, to rebuild. So the impacts are really, really profound. For the WHO, they've lost 20% of their core funding immediately. This means about 40% of their staff are being cut right now. And the other key thing that it does, which is extremely important to recognize, is it legitimizes the withdrawal of major powers from the multilateral system. This is absolutely critical. It's like putting a massive hole in the bottom of your canoe as you're trying to course through very dangerous waters. If you've done it, everyone else can do it. And what happens to the system? You can well imagine. So the issues that derive from the end of the myth of the international liberal order. First, we need a new story. Second, the question is, what is Canada's role? There's no question in my mind that Canada, as a middle power, can play a very significant role. There's also no question that Canada, as a middle power, must act in its own wise self-interest. We have, as I alluded to at the beginning of my comments, we have major domestic issues that very well may, I don't want to pretend, but may get worse in the coming 12 months. So what is our role? Well, I think there's two main areas that I think are really worth planting in this group. One is that our values as a Canadian society are deeply rooted in that idea of it is wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others. Our tolerance for inequity is far lower than the tolerance for inequity that exists south of the border. We've built a system, a society, on that basic principle, that it's wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others. And that when we do that, we create a context where individuals can take initiative and they can thrive. And they can then contribute back to the basic social and economic structure of our society that reinforces this idea of it's wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others. Now, we can extend that to the international system in its current state of absolute deconstruction and growing ineffectiveness. And I think we can learn something from the Americans around taking a critical problem-solving approach. We cannot do everything, especially in this circumstance, this new rupture that we are literally in, and that we are literally, like many around the world, experiencing deep, deep impacts and suffering. But we can learn to take a critical problem-solving approach. And we can look at what are the major needs internationally from a global health perspective. And I think there are two that we can do something about, that we have the expertise, we have the capacity, and we have the way of doing things, which is partnership. Partnership with others. It's a very Canadian thing. And believe me, I've seen much internationally. But the idea that partnership is better than aloneship, this is a very Canadian idea. And while we don't often practice it perfectly, we actually practice it far better than most. So what are the areas? I think Canada can take a leadership role in supporting the World Health Organization and in creating a coalition of willing states that will fund the WHO and reform the WHO, because it does, there's no question. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's absolutely not. Fund and reform the WHO so it can meet its responsibility for defining and addressing major challenges of the public good as they apply to health. And there, very practically, we have enormous capacity in vaccine technology, science, and development across this country. And we have enormous relationships and powerful relationships with many around the world. I think we should focus our material support around vaccine development for global public goods. That's one major suggestion. And then the other is that deeply consistent with our values are humanitarian values. And that idea that that it is wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others, most fundamental to that is the relief of suffering when that relief is possible. In the face of remediable suffering, to do nothing and to simply leave others to suffer is deeply unconscionable. But to respond to that through measured, focused interventions not only reinforces our own sense of self and purpose and relationship to others, it also preserves and enhances certain norms and practices in humanitarianism and global health that are fundamental to any future multilateral system, however imperfect that system may be. That is fundamental. And so I think that very clearly there, while OCHA, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is a different animal than most other multilateral agencies, it's a coordinating and structuring organization that coordinates other UN agencies in humanitarian crises, that works with non-government organizations, both domestically and internationally, to coordinate, direct, and seek clarity around goals, and also to coordinate funding. I think Canada could and should develop a focused policy on how to support OCHA. And that can include targeted financing with trigger mechanisms for very particular kinds of acute humanitarian needs. Let me just close by saying that, in 2000, the year 2000, there were 21 million internally displaced people in the world. Today, 25 years later, there are 123 million internally displaced people in the world. And in addition to those who are internally displaced. There are millions more, for a total of about 305 million people around the world who need basic humanitarian assistance. And when I say basic, I mean a tent, I mean a bucket, I mean access to Tylenol. That is what we're talking about. We're not talking about MRIs and CT scanners and all of that. We're talking about basic. If those 305 million people, if we define those basic needs, OCHA puts a price tag on that, and then goes to various donor countries and says, please give us some money. It's a donor-based system. Of the 100% of need that is defined, less than 18% is actually funded. Right? So, and again, we are talking about tents, buckets, chlorine for water, and Tylenol, that level, and BP5 biscuits for food and nutrition. Less than 18% of need is actually funded. Now that is atrocious. That is absolutely atrocious. And we are now in a circumstance where that, even that 18% is very likely to fall, right, unless there is a concerted effort on the part of leadership nations like Canada to make sure that that 18% becomes 50%, becomes 100% in the reality of our changing world order. Mark Carney is absolutely right. This is a moment of rupture. The key is that he so clearly holds is to first see the world not as you would like it, but as it is. This is reality, and you're going to discuss today many other aspects of the new reality, security, and so on and so on. This is part of reality. See the world as it is. Find yourself. Find the clarity of vision as to who you are in that reality. And then act concretely and with a critical problem-solving approach to at least make a significant, determined, and intelligent approach to creating the world that we want. We will see where we go. We will see where we land in a year, in 5 years, and in 10 years. These are certainly rocky waters, but I will close just by reminding that uniquely, I won't say unique, it maybe is the wrong word, but deeply held by Canadians is this concept and this value that it's wise self-interest to be concerned with the welfare of others. It is to the benefit of others, but it's also to the benefit of ourselves. I wish you a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So if the world is in a rupture, who's going to stitch it up? That's something that we're going to be looking at today. I want to just acknowledge before we move into our second panel, all of you are distinguished and make contributions to your communities in this college. But we do have Elizabeth Dowdeswell with us, the former Lieutenant Governor and a terrific diplomat. She's done a lot of stitching in her time. And I noticed at the back as well, David Zimmer, the former Minister of Indigenous Relations here in Ontario. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break for our next panel. The time to go to the washroom or get another quick cup of coffee, and we're going to call our second panel to come together to begin to look at some of those details of this new world that James sketched. Okay, so come back in 5, and if we can have the second panel come up to the front. Okay, Charlie.
I'm still trying to find a date, but we're going to get together with Mark and Lola sometime soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin in a minute. Knows at this state of time. Will it be the old continent of Europe? Will it be the three emperors? Will it be anarchy? How does the world cope? And we have as one of our guest speakers this afternoon, Kim Nozzle from Queen's University, wrote a very prescient book on Canada alone. Is Canada alone one of the possibilities in this ruptured world? And if we're not alone, who are we with? So these are profound questions for our country and profound questions for the world, with no one having answers or prescriptions at the moment, certainly no consensus around that. And meetings like this are beginning that discussion and dialogue, and they'll have to be held in so many different places for us to get a clear direction on where we think we're going to go. The Prime Minister began that process with his speech at Davos. So it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of our panel on the global system under stress, Leah Taylor-Roy, who is very distinguished businesswoman, was the MP for Aurora, Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill. She has an MPP from the Kennedy School at Harvard University, and to show her discernment, she was wise enough not to take my classes. So this is obviously a woman of judgment right away. So Leah is going to introduce the panel and take us into that exciting but difficult world that James outlined that all Canadians should be thinking about. Leah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. And I must say, it wasn't intentional that I did not take Tom's courses. My schedule just didn't allow. But want to welcome everyone here, and this is a very important panel, an important discussion. And I appreciate all of the knowledge in the room as well. Everyone who is here has a perspective on this, as well as the four panelists here who all come from different backgrounds and will address slightly different issues pertaining to the global order under stress and how we should move forward. So it's 1 year only into a profoundly altered era in Washington, and we've also already seen unmistakable and, as James said earlier, devastating consequences of the actions that an unpredictable administration has taken. Under Trump, there's been a lot of long-standing assumptions that we've held that are no longer true. And speaking at Davos last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney captured the moment succinctly when he said that periods of global disruption demand not withdrawal, but renewed cooperation and resolve. He said a lot of other very important things in that speech, but really he argued that countries like Canada, like us, have a responsibility to help steady the system by defending sovereignty and democratic values, maintaining strong alliances, and building economic resilience. Now, it's quite complex when it comes to the United States right now, and we need to think about bilateral relationships as well as multilateral organizations. So from US actions and rhetoric around sovereignty, whether in Venezuela, Greenland, or even closer to home here in Canada, we've seen a big change to a more transactional view of trade and alliances and pressures on the global order. They're no longer abstract. So we can't afford to stand still. And what these panelists today here who are joining me are going to be talking about is how we move forward in specific areas. And so I wanted to introduce the exceptional group of panelists this morning. And I'd ask each of them to just speak for a couple of minutes first, to introduce themselves. Then we're going to have specific questions for each of the panelists. At the end of each answer from the panelists, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think everyone here has ideas, thoughts, questions, and each of these areas is fairly distinct. So we'll come to you, the audience. Someone will bring a mic into the audience. If you have any comments, questions to add, that would be wonderful. We're on a bit of a tight schedule, so unfortunately we probably won't be able to take all of them, but hopefully at the end we'll have a little time for questions as well. So let me start by introducing our panelists, and I'm going in alphabetical order to begin. So our first panelist, Carolyn Johns, sitting to my right, a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, chair of the Bruce Fellowship in Canadian Freshwater Policy, and member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. So water security and sustainability is clearly an important issue for bilateral relations with the United States. And so, Carol, I'm going to turn it over to you for a brief introduction.
Great. Thanks, Leah. Thanks for the invitation, Tom, for inviting me to participate. I'm also a Massey Senior Fellow, so really nice to be able to contribute in this way as a fellow. I just want to highlight my perspective is that my work has primarily focused on public policy and implementation of policies in the Great Lakes region, basically to attain really important policy goals like swimmable, fishable, drinkable waters and clean, healthy water for future generations. I've always viewed the Great Lakes as my social science laboratory. As a political science scholar, it has all the wonderful, interesting research questions that have kind of embarked my whole career to focus on the Great Lakes. My work is primarily focused on water pollution and water quality, growing up in the Great Lakes on Lake Erie and now living in Lake Ontario. And most of the time in my studies, we've taken the state of Canada-US relations as a given, as a stable, trusting, cooperative relationship. And it's only been in the last year and a bit that I've been kind of drawn into more questions about water security, water sovereignty, and where we're headed in terms of long-standing agreements and collaborative institutions. So I'm not an international relations or foreign policy scholar. I come at this from a very public policy perspective, but I am currently embarking on a new research agenda, and I'm actually trying to recruit a postdoc to focus on water security and water sovereignty. If any young people in the room or anyone knows of any postdocs that might be interested in really becoming the next generation of scholars to focus on this. So thank you, Leah. Thanks again, Tom, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Great. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And next we'll go to Charles McMillan, or Charlie, who's from the Schulich School of Business, one of our leading Asia experts and also former senior policy advisor to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Charlie?
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm going to make 3 comments, rather forcefully. Before I get into that, I don't think people fully understand the role of the United States, and we live in a dollar world. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, largely led by John Maynard Keynes, said that with the British in serious trouble in wartime, that the British pound that had run the world for 100 years was no longer a safe currency. And that became the dollar. Keynes himself wanted other tools, perhaps a special note backed by several countries, but it became the US dollar. And that meant that the United States became the safe haven for rich people, for countries in trouble, countries in revolution, to park their money in the United States. And that money was shrewdly used to build up the United States economy, US corporations, US research, and a lot of altruistic programs like the World Health Organization or global health. That's gone. So 3 comments that I'd like to make. The United States is the only country other than Japan with a huge internal market and no barriers between the states. Japan is a country of over 120 million people with no barriers, with a common language, common legal system, common currency. Europe is fractionated, and the United States and Canada is fractionated, with the provincial barriers being the most egregious example. We made changes, but that's not enough. Second point, Canada has become too complacent. Some of our appointments in government are weak. Some of the private sector hasn't invested in research and development. It's scandalous that corporate Canada spends less than certain companies in total R&D, and that's existed for 10 years. And then we've got other internal problems, including our healthcare system and our university system. The third thing is that when you look at the Trump administration, it's easy to fall into the trap that Donald Trump is the problem. He's the symptom of a much bigger problem, which is Project 25. And there's a whole series of people backing the Trump administration, and it's become America alone. They're backing out of multilateral institutions, and that's the serious issue, not Trump himself, who is an autocrat and a congenital liar. The final comment I'll mention, Canada is well positioned because we have a long history of multilateral but bilateral deals with the United States, but around the world. And Canada is well positioned both in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and Europe to take the lead, and I think there's an appetite for the Canadian model, but we have to put the best people and the best ideas forward, and that's where your ideas are really important to shape Canada's response.
Thank you, Charlie, and I'm glad you ended on that note of optimism that there is a lot we can do. Now I'd like to introduce Terry O'Leary, a former board member, director at the World Bank, vice president of Toronto Global, and CEO of Invest Toronto. And Terry brings a global investment and development perspective as well to this. And so if you'd like to begin with your opening remarks, Terry.
Thank you. Just want to thank Tom and the organizers. It's hard not to feel quite battered and bruised in this environment right now, so finding kind of collective community in each other and being able to talk about these ideas and share new ideas, I think is really important. This is an understatement to say that we're in an unprecedented crisis. It is not like the deficit crisis in the 90s or the financial crisis. It's something we've never, ever seen before. I think that the epic speech of statecraft that Mark Carney did at Davos, I think was important and resonated for a couple of reasons. One, I think that we all knew that it was really bad and it was wrong what was happening, but nobody had really articulated some of the reasons why and how it affected Canada. And I think that that speech did that, and I think it also really resonated because it elevated Canada to some of the epic issues in international fora that we've had before, where Canada has taken a leading role. And I would say that would be on apartheid and Romeo Dallaire's position on Rwanda. Sometimes middle income countries or middle powers are able to state right up front what is real and what is not real, and also understand that in diplomacy, sometimes kindness and sometimes understanding gets you a lot farther. But these are some of the biggest issues that we are ever going to face. because of what Charlie has enunciated about the economic dependency that we have on the United States, bar none, but also because our international institutions are going to have to sit this one out while we realize and formulate new, quite frankly, economic relationships while we get over this. But it's also going to be a very important time for Canada because we're going to have to build like we've never built before. We're going to have to embrace new opportunities like we never have before. And we are going to need a partnership with the business community and with government that, as mentioned before, has not existed. And it means we're going to have new arrangements across all different lines and also operate as one Canada more in practice than in preaching. And right now it has been mostly in practice, not in practice, but in preaching. So I think the challenge is going to be immense. I would say that the Bretton Woods institutions, I do lament their end. I was very proud to represent Canada at the World Bank. It was amazing to me, literally over a decade later, how many people would literally call out any Canadian that worked at the bank for what we did on some crucial issues under Brian Mulroney on apartheid, with Romeo Dallaire, even with when I work with Paul Martin on the G20. Those initiatives really speak to the role that Canada can play, but it's going to take some time for us to be able to concentrate on what we rebuild multilaterally, because we really need to fix our own backyard right now, and that's going to take everything that we've got. And it's going to be an enormous challenge. We've never done it before, like we have to do it right now, and I think the call to arms that the Prime Minister gave us actually gave us a real understanding that we can forge a way forward, but we're going to have to think in very, very different terms and make very, very different alliances with a lot of different players that we've never done before, and it is going to take our best and our brightest. And I hope to see some of you at that, playing that role.
Thank you very much, Terry. And last but not least, Ben Roswell. Ben is our former ambassador to Venezuela, president of the Canadian International Council, and now with Catalyze 4, a strategic advisory firm. I was also say Ben has also, probably his most important role was we were campaigning together at one point, and so he also has down in the trenches political experience. But Ben, I appreciate your perspective from a kind of democratic or global geopolitical perspective. So over to you.
Thank you, Leah. We were very happy to get you into Parliament in 2021, and hopefully we'll get another chance in the future. I wanted to, yes, that's right. Not that it's a partisan crowd. I wanted to mention, offer a note of hope, not about the character of the United States, which has become a fully authoritarian regime, and has adopted an imperial approach to the world, and has put an end to the rules-based international order on which all of our prosperity and our security has depended for the past 8 years. So no optimism on that front. We're going to have to learn how to navigate by sharing a continent with an imperialist dictatorship. But the note of hope that I wanted to offer was that Canada has quite a lot of power in our relationship with the United States. They obviously are a superpower, and we are a middle power, and if it ever came to open military conflict, there'd be no contest. But it doesn't come to that, and in fact, we have a tremendous amount of experience dealing with the United States. We have, in fact, been doing it for as long as we've been a country. I'll just draw a few notes from my own career to show some examples. I had studied at Georgetown University, so did an IR degree in Washington and worked at our embassy in Washington at the very beginning of my career. I was then pulled into the Privy Council office after 9/11. It now seems like quite a long time ago, but we had a more severe border crisis with the United States after 9/11 than ever since. They completely shut the border for several days, costing us something like $1 billion in revenue, and so it shot to the top priority of our entire government, and we put together a small team to negotiate with the White House under Deputy Prime Minister Paul Manley, and I was lucky to be one of the 4 or 5 people supporting John Manley in that. So even on an issue that was the absolute top priority for the United States in the world in 2001, which was how to protect their borders so that they wouldn't suffer another catastrophic terrorist attack, we were able to more than hold our own in those negotiations and force open the border. We introduced new, the reason we called it a smart border is we managed to use data to separate out flows of both people and goods by risk profile, and then devote all of our interdiction efforts to a small percentage where there was a risk, and allow the 98% of everything else to go. It ended up being a win-win. The United States said at the beginning there was like absolutely no way security would be the only factor at the border, but because of our considerable economic weight and our political leadership and diplomatic prowess, we were able to secure a situation for Canada that was extremely favorable. I went on to then serve inside the U.S. Occupying Authority in Iraq from 2003 to 2005, and if anything ever disabuses you of how the tremendous power of a country can produce absolutely awful results, watching the catastrophic failure of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq was a reminder that, you know, Canadian foreign policy is not so bad. We've got a lot more strategic culture. We've got a more effective way of changing course, of making decisions on when we recognize we're headed for failure than the United States. It was trapped in a failure that ultimately costed something like $3 trillion and thousands and thousands of lives. So even at its greatest, and the US is much less powerful than it was in the early 2000s, even at its greatest, it can be extremely weak, and we can be extremely effective. I went on the basis of my experience in Iraq to lead the Canada/US provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar, so at the very heart of the conflict, which then dominated both American foreign policy and Canadian foreign policy in the most dangerous province, the heartland of the Taliban, where Canada ran the show, and the United States came in under Obama with a surge and chose, because of our effectiveness on the ground in Kandahar, to place American troops under our command and to place the American civilians under my control as the lead diplomat. I had 20 State Department diplomats and a dozen USAID employees, all in a unified structure called the Provincial Reconstruction Team. Obviously, we failed to reconstruct Kandahar. I'm not saying that this was a success story, but what I am saying is that when on the issues that are absolute top priority for the United States, Canada more than holds its own. And that will be the case in any other issue that comes forward, because our entire existence as a country depends on our skill in managing the United States, and that's why we've been so damn good at it for 158 years. And we are going to be good at it even as the United States fundamentally changes its character. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you for all your contributions, and I think perhaps you could give a bit of a history lesson to President Trump on what happened in Afghanistan. But I want to start now with some questions, and I'm going to direct my first one to you, Terry, starting with the economic challenges and U.S.-Canadian trade relations. So right now, none of us know the future of CUSMA, but as an economic strategist who has spent much time trying to attract investment to Toronto, how prepared are we if CUSMA is allowed to lapse? And what do you think Canada and perhaps Mexico can do to prevent this or be prepared for the eventuality?
Well, first of all, it was amazing to me in the time that I was at Toronto Global how successful we were at landing U.S. companies in the Toronto region. And not one of them ever regretted their decision, by the way. I mean, it really worked out quite well. All that is changed now, all of that. There's nothing coming into the region right now, very little, because of the uncertainty created by what is going to happen with CUSMA and also what is happening with regard sector by sector on the tariff structure. So, you know, quite little. It is the Wild West out there for businesses. It is a terrible, terrible situation for them to face, because if the one thing business can't deal with is uncertainty and instability. So we are, I think, psychologically, I think the Prime Minister's speech is getting us more prepared. But are we prepared for the United States to abrogate CUSMA? No, we're not. We are so economically dependent on that arrangement. Now, we should give ourselves a little bit of a pat on the back. We did it right. We had a royal commission in this country on whether or not we should have an integrated trade framework with the United States. We had federal election campaigns on the trade agreement. We reintroduced and changed our tax system to leverage the integration better. But that's all in the past. We should pat ourselves on the back for doing the right thing, public policy, but now it's put us in a precarious position. And that's why I say that the new arrangements that we have with the business community and with government are going to be critical. You know, one of the other things I've done in my past is I was Paul Martin's chief of staff during the 1990s. And at the start of the deficit fight, which bears no comparison to what we're doing right now, by the way. But one of the things that he talked about was that he thought that Canadians had withdrawn their consent to be governed. There was a huge underground economy. There was huge resentment in terms of Canadians' ability or the government's ability to deal with these fiscal issues. And I think that is a little bit the case right now. I think when people look across government, whether it's on transit, whether it's on housing, it's not working. It's inexplicable to people that Eglinton Crosstown exists in the state that it is right now. It is inexplicable to people that you say you've gotten rid of internal trade barriers and we still can't buy wine in BC, and no, you can't work in every province without getting certified. That stuff has to end. It really does, because people need to understand that government can be a big player in this. But business also needs to come to the table. And business needs to understand how important it is to back Canadian winners. And they need to find a way to make money, but make us more secure and make us prouder and invest in our companies. And that's why I say the whole nature of that relationship is changing. It's going to offer enormous opportunities. But in the meantime, we're going to go through a world of hurt because we're not ready for it. And I think one of the things that I think I'm going to be doing is, you know, we've got some great people that are negotiating this. The business community needs to come to the fore, like both in Canada and the United States. The best thing that we've got is the weight of the Canadian and American business community. But the question is, and I think that's why one of the lines in the Prime Minister's speech that was so important when he was going through Havel's Power of the Powerless is he called on companies and countries to take down the sign. And he's calling on the business community to get on with the program and help government do better. Get into government if you've ever had a desire to be in public service. The same thing on the other side if you're in public service and want to get into government. Now is the time really for us to put all of our efforts into securing new arrangements and being able to get us off the trade dependency we have in the United States, but also understand it's going to take time and build up some strengths along the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, I know. Thank you, Terry. That's yeah, and I think it's one of the areas where we have commonality, the business communities across Canada and the United States, and we've seen the deputations and the perspective of the American business community that have been brought to the administration in the U.S. So I think working together is a way to build an alliance there.
Although I would add, I mean, Bob Rubin had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, and he was the Treasury Secretary when Mr. Martin was the Finance Minister, calling on the United States business community to stand up and say something. Say something about what's happening with Canada. Say something about what's happening in the sectors that they're in. So I do think that there's been a degree of silence that needs to be lifted.
Absolutely. We need more courage. Ben, did you want to comment on this?
There we go. I've made a few comments publicly about how CUSMA is more likely to fail as a negotiation than to succeed, and I think that should reinforce the point that Terry's making, that we do need to really prepare ourselves for a different world economically. My read of this is simply that this is a trade negotiation in which the technical expertise of the two teams, which we have quite a lot, is probably not all that important, because of the way that President Trump negotiates is that he takes whatever his underlings have come up with, you know, having pushed the other side as far as possible, and then he just measures like how much farther can I push them and what other leverage can I use elsewhere. So given that we know that that's going to be the sort of end state, the end game of the negotiation, we should recognize that ultimately this will be a negotiation over something political, where he's trying to seek, he will seek to try and establish some kind of dominance over us and have us recognize American dominance in some way. To defend against that, we have to have a credible threat to be able to walk away from the agreement. And that's why I think we should be explicit about our willingness right off the bat to walk away from CUSMA. The business community is very, very focused on renewing, because I mean, we do want to have market access, and I understand that. But I think in terms of the broader public debate, there should be voices saying, let us let us openly consider a world without CUSMA, because we need that even just for our negotiation to get the best deal. And it might also end up being our fate. And so the sooner we start wrapping our heads around that, the better.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I did want to turn it over to anyone sitting in the audience for comments or questions as well. Do you want to come and take this mic then and come around? I'll bring it over here to you, myself, and then we can get it passed around. Thank you.
I was interested in hearing Charlie McMillan mention Project 25, and my question would be, even though Trump may be a figurehead, to what extent is he a vital one? That is, how cohesive is Project 25, and do you think it would be as cohesive if it had not had Trump to rally around?
It's a double question.
Yes.
Question there. Trump is a fantastic salesman. You know, on a political basis, and he understands the bully pulpit, with the emphasis on bully as well as pulpit. And his campaign team really knew how Fox News and social media played into Trump, but the Democrats were extremely weak. And it was even more confusing during the campaign with shift of leaders. There's an interview in Saturday's Financial Times about the head of Project 25. And it's a serious point. It was over at lunch. You know, they have a weekly luncheon at the Financial Times. But if you read into what he's saying, they will go to any extreme. And they're looking in post-Trump world. Steve Bannon still thinks that Trump can run for the third term. But they will go to any extreme, and it's all MAGA first and unilateralism. And CUSMA is important. I'm not downplaying that, but everything is mega. And I think we're underestimating, so just to pick up on your point, if you look at the governors, the private sector in Canada, the private sector doesn't have great relationship with the universities and university researchers. Silicon Valley is all about the universities. The Defense Department, defense companies are all about university research. The pharmaceutical companies are all about university research. And when we talk about the private sector, our private sector is horrible at venture capital, including the banking system, and links with the universities. And that's got to change, because in the industry of the future, universities are everything. And you mentioned food. The finance minister, our Canadian finance minister, said we're a food superpower or whatever. Could be a food. We're 10th in exports, behind Japan, Britain, and Holland. Holland is as big as my little finger. And they're one of the leading food exporters. You talk about health. The other thing is that starvation. The world is starving. I wrote a book on food production. Paradox in Canada, including Britain, by the way, and the United States, food abundance and food shortages because of these internal programs. And unfortunately, the last two ministers of finance, of agriculture, came from PEI. Give me a break.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for those honest remarks. And when the mic is passed you, could you just say your name and where you're from as well before you ask the question? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jansen. I'm from Toronto. Does that work? Some of you might be aware that this morning the European Union signed a free trade agreement with India. Free trade agreements are all the rage nowadays, especially when they're not with the United States. Given our geographic limitations, what else can we do? I mean, the Prime Minister's always been, has already been promoting trade with Canada and with a lot of other countries. But what are our alternatives realistically?
Thank you, Jansen from Toronto. And maybe we'll go back over to you, Terry, to answer.
Well, first of all, I think the trade deal, we've always had great trade deals under every prime minister, right? The question is, we're the only G7 country that has a trade deal with every other member of the G7 country. We could just law them out. But it still hasn't diversified our trade mix. And it goes back, I believe, anyway, to the business community. Algoma Steel announced a great partnership yesterday with a South Korean submarine manufacturer. Those are the tangible kind of things that happens. I think Charlie's right. I think the business community in this country is missing such a key ingredient without these partnerships with the university. DARPA in the United States started out and became a revolution in the defense industry because it was integrated within the university structure. And I think that we have to understand that those linkages are going to be paramount for us. But it means taking those trade deals and disseminating them down into real, concrete, tangible deliverables. I mean, I think Scott Moe going to China with Prime Minister Carney was really important. I think that we underestimate how important the agricultural industries are in this country and what Western Canada has done. We need new markets. We need an announcement of a new market for canola and canola oil. Those kind of things are going to have to be, and I think they will be, the kind of things that we enact in 2026. And I think that's going to be critical to get people to understand that it's going to all be transactional, but it means it's going to be with different markets we haven't looked at before.
Thank you very much. And I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next panelist in question. The next question is for you, Carolyn. And this is in the area, of course, of water security, which is very, very important in terms of our bilateral relationships with the United States. You know, the U.S. has withdrawn from formal climate change agreements and many other international environmental commitments, and water has been mentioned by the President in rhetoric about Canada's natural resources. Bodies such as the International Joint Commission and bilateral agreements governing transboundary waters have so far survived. What is your assessment of Great Lakes environmental cooperation and water issues in the context of Trump's statements and Canada-U.S. relations? And do you feel our water security and sovereignty are threatened? And if so, how can Canada mitigate? Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Big questions, really big questions. I'm gonna. It's a two-part question, kind of, but I'm gonna tackle the second one first. Do I feel our water security and sovereignty are being threatened? And if so, how to mitigate? So I would say it's very clear in this morning so far that we are in a new context, and that applies to water. I'll just kind of link to yours that water was not part of NAFTA and CUSMA, but who knows? It could be also an important item in the trade context. But what we do know is that Donald Trump has been using rhetoric that Canada's a very large faucet. He's paused the renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty and made threats to other transboundary water agreements. He's cut funding and positions at many environment, climate, and water agencies and organizations in the United States. And related to Drill Baby Drill, he's also taken actions to weaken water protections, regulations, the Clean Water Act, environmental justice, and restrict and undermine state water quality reviews. The desire to control natural resource wealth is also part of Trump's Western Hemisphere domination strategy. But I'm going to quote somebody that had a really interesting quote in a report that was sent to parliamentarians in April 2025, a joint statement by 85 Indigenous, environmental, and other water protectors in Canada asked all political parties and representatives to commit to defending Canada's fresh water. And I pulled a quote from this submission because the quote is, "There is no economy or sovereignty without fresh water." And I think that's a really powerful quote, and it's important to help understand and remind the Trump administration, given the interdependence that we share related to water, and not just transboundary waters, all waters. The second point is water security and sovereignty are becoming of concern increasingly, not just because of the rhetoric and actions that we've seen so far, but because of other important concerns related to water that are occurring simultaneously. So we're all well aware that climate change, droughts, floods, wildfires, aging infrastructure, vulnerable water systems, these are threats that must be thought of alongside of the current tactics and approach of the American government. Thirdly, water security and sovereignty is not just an economic issue. I think this is really important to think about. Trump's rhetoric and approach comes from thinking it's predominantly an economic good. But where there's a critical difference related to water and other natural resources is water is different. Water is critical in terms of its role in all economic sectors, and of course we're hearing a lot about its increasing importance in terms of data centers and AI and the future economic transitions. But water is a fundamental human right, and I think that this is something that we need to really learn from Indigenous peoples and leaders. They teach us water is life, it's fundamental to ecosystems and to future generations. And that perspective is really important in countering the economic approach that we're being positioned with right now. So those are kind of my thoughts on water security and sovereignty, and then what is my assessment of the Great Lakes as you know, a very important transboundary basin. So as many of you know, of our 8,891 kilometer border from the Atlantic to the Pacific, 40% of our border is water. 13 major river basins in the Great Lakes, with the Great Lakes holding 20% of the world's fresh water. From a Trump perspective, the Great Lakes region is also a critical economic region. We know that the region that has 8 U.S. states, 2 Canadian provinces, is a global economic powerhouse with an estimated GDP of $9 trillion annually. As the Council for the Great Lakes region tells us, if the region were a country, it would have the third largest economy, supports millions of jobs and roughly 30% of Canadian and U.S. employment. So one thing I think that's important to kind of think about in terms of the assessment is the rhetoric about water needs to include the rhetoric that any kind of change in how we govern our waters collectively and in partnership is bad for business. And I think this is a message that Donald Trump might resonate with the Trump administration. It's bad for business investment in the region. And water is not isolated in that regard because it's connected to energy, to food, to security, and it requires trust. And building on the integration that we've heard about has kind of deepened over the last 30 years. The second point I want to make about kind of the assessment is that we do have long-standing agreements and institutions. And then you mentioned, Leah, that thus far the International Joint Commission has not been meddled with. We still have strong IJC commissioners, 3 appointed by the President, 3 appointed by the Prime Minister. The IJC has been a long-standing organization since the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. And over its history, with its dedicated commissioners and staff and all the boards that kind of work with the IJC, it's resolved over 100 disputes in 117 years. So the question is whether, you know, that's going to change and whether the IJC needs to change. And there's Kim Nozzle and Elizabeth Dowdswell are in the room today, and they know very well. The IJC has certain levers of power, but it's not a super strong international organization, and it is one that we really need to pay attention to, its capacity to address problems in the future. At the same time, we have lots of well-developed subnational cooperation and diplomacy, and I think that's really important to think about as well. We often think of like the federal government and the transboundary organizations like the IJC, but we have many, many subnational organizations like the Great Lakes Commission and the Great Lakes Compact, Great Lakes Governors and Premiers, the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, the Great Lakes Cities Initiative, many organizations that have been built up over the past 100 years to share and manage our transboundary waters, as well as many developed communities of practice. So there are lots of academics and public servants that have dedicated their lives to protecting the waters and managing the Great Lakes. So I'll just close, and I'm kind of coming on my 10 minutes here, that I think there are many different ways we can mitigate and strengthen our water security and sovereignty. It's in both our countries' interests to recognize the political and the economic interests in keeping relations collaborative. Although our neighbor is an adversarial power, we do have common values related to water. And developments like the establishment of the Canada Water Agency, having Global Affairs Canada and the Canada Water Agency working together on water security and thinking about water sovereignty, these are really important developments. And I think working with provinces, territories, and First Nations has to be part of that, given the constitutional reality of how we govern waters. The other is we do need to bolster our knowledge of water. We know we have a lot of it, but we really need to understand the significance of water to all sectors of the economy, to people, and to our ecosystems. And I think we have a long way to go on that front. We take water for granted, and we need to really understand water, connecting to the point about, you know, investing in universities as well, but also just across the board. Also build on the point that we need more engagement of water leaders across all sectors. So many of the organizations that I mentioned to date in my opening remarks, they are government-based organizations or non-government organizations. And business organizations are there, and we do have organizations that try to bring business together, but we do need more leadership by business and industry in terms of transboundary waters and the economic significance of waters. Water's not likely to be a primary midterm election issue, but I think we do need to think about Canada relations will be, and many of the Great Lakes states are really critical political states in the upcoming midterms. So I think that's a really important strategic angle that Canada could consider. And in addition to kind of continuing to demonstrate the economic value of shared waters, I really think we need to deepen the human rights approach to water to counter that economic approach to water. Because the future is going to have to be built on awareness of water values in Canada, water citizenship, building that across the border, centering Indigenous knowledge, and deepening our respect and responsibilities related to water. And in closing, I think that there's much to do. A lot of that has to be done through bilateralism, because unlike other areas of natural resources, we can't look outside of the continent related to water. We really need to focus on the continental, transboundary, domestic, and Arctic realities related to water. And so we have to deal in a bilateral way. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And that was, you know, water is, we did a lengthy study on water in the Environment Committee, and a number of the Indigenous First Nations witnesses that came to speak to us, you know, it was a real contrast to the idea of resource management, the idea that water is life, and it's just so central to everything. And I think when we look at what's happening bilaterally and globally, we do have allies in some of these organizations and the Indigenous populations across both countries. And I think these are areas where we can work together to strengthen the ties and deal with some of these really important issues. I'm going to turn it over to all of you again, if anyone has any questions regarding water and our relation with the United States. Thank you.
Monty McMurchie, citizen. One can live without food for several days. One cannot live without water for hours. I've spent a great deal of time in Africa, which means I don't know very much, but what I do know, I know. Conflict is going to be embedded with potable access to water. The states are running out or have run out, and it's going to be a visceral fight. And it goes back to another query comment, is that our political publics need to be long-term, apolitical, not necessarily parochial partisan, but national in a sense of rubric. Carney attempted to strike that, and he did it with significant success based on the pushback from mob boss Trump presenting as POTUS. And power is power. As Northrop Frye said in the Bush Garden, underline the word Bush and Garden, where is here when he talks about our Canadian social, economic, political publics? We are a nation with awesome potential, but sadly our political leadership class has let us down magnificently, that there's a great deal of talk and it requires courage. And the only way to deal with a bully is to punch the bully in the face in a sense that you strike him off. And I know it may be harsh, and it's going to be harsh, but to me, the enablers have allowed what has happened in the States. Prestigious law firms, prestigious universities, Ivy Leagues, they have all crumpled for the most part because they were fearful. We need to rise to courage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think there was a question there, but thank you for your comments. Okay, yes, over here.
Short one. What you gonna do if Alberta wants to go out and become 51 state? They have a referendum coming. So it's not, when you talk about Canada, you always say we, as we are all unity. We are not. Quebec long ago wanted to go. Now Alberta is encouraged, and encouraged by the previous government of Trudeau in a different sense, in a very negative sense. And now they're strongly encouraged by Trump's administration to leave. And they might. That's a very serious threat inside of Canada. So can you address that?
Ben, it sounds like it was directed to you, so we'll go over to you.
It looks to me like you're very young,
Yes,
but
yes.
with the gray hair, you had a lot of experience.
I think the gray hair is because of the experience.
No, it's a good point that there are divisions within Canada. We are a democratic country, of course, and so we will allow Albertans the exercise of their democratic rights in making that selection. I'm quite confident, given the very low percentage of support for separatism, that those Albertans that want to remain part of Canada will prevail. Just as Quebec chose twice to remain in Canada. You mentioned that Quebec wanted to separate. In fact, when the question was put to the people of Quebec, twice they voted to stay in Canada. It was close, obviously, the second time. But that's what happens when you allow people to be free. They choose to remain as part of a great country of their own volition, and I'm sure the same will happen with Alberta as well.
Thank you, Ben. And I would also say that, of course, we have First Nations that will have a choice as well, and I think that weighs into the decision, and I'm not sure what they would decide in that referendum. Thank you, though. Okay.
Wait and see.
Okay, we'll wait and see on that. Okay, the next question, and thank you again, Carolyn, is in fact for Ben. Ben, I guess, it's funny, when we started to plan this panel, we were talking about Venezuela. Since then, we've had Venezuela, Greenland, and now threats from the United States over our deals with China. So things have been moving quickly with the United States, and not necessarily in a linear or logical fashion. But I will go back to talking about Venezuela and Greenland for a moment, Ben. And just in terms of the precedent you think has been set by recent U.S. actions in both Venezuela and obviously the economic coercion regarding Greenland, how can Canada and our allies respond to these actions and stabilize the situation and protect national sovereignty here at home as well?
Thank you very much, Leah. It does, with the pace of news these days, Venezuela does seem like several crises ago, even though it was, 2.5 weeks ago that the United States violated the sovereignty of that country and snatched the president from within his own capital. But I do think that Venezuela obviously I'm very passionate about Venezuela. If anyone has any questions about the domestic situation in that country, please do pose it. I do think for the purposes of this conference, Venezuela is actually quite important as a bellwether in international relations. And Applebaum referred to that attack on the 3rd of January as the moment that the rules-based international order ended. I think the argument is that the cardinal rule of the rules-based international system is sovereign equality. And if there's a second one, it's that countries shouldn't have colonies. And those were both shattered on the 3rd of January. The Prime Minister, of course, then reinforced that message with his speech at Davos, that the rules-based international order is important. Now, when it comes to what we learned from the United States in Venezuela, I think it allows us to see the new United States more clearly, and in fact to see that it's a United States that we're actually familiar with if we just go back in history. This event is being co-hosted by the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History, and so I think that perspective is quite helpful here. One can look at the relationship between the United States and the rest of the Americas in terms of 3 eras. There might be more, but there's one from 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine is pronounced, until 1933, when it's replaced by the good neighbor policy of FDR, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt then ushering in a fundamentally different approach between the United States and the rest of the world, on which the United Nations, the rules-based international order, and everything else was built. But from 1933 up until 1993, the United States still allowed its geopolitical competition to to take primacy over the objectives of the good neighbor policy. And so there are several U.S. interventions in the second phase, most recently in 1989 when the Bush 1 administration invaded Panama to remove their president at the time, Manuel Noriega. But there's a third period that I think is quite significant for Latin American history, and that's 1993 or 1994, if you date it from the Summit of the Americas in Miami under President Clinton to roughly 2024. So a 30-year period in which not only is there very little U.S. intervention, at least not in the overtly military sense that we've now seen a return to, but this is a period of remarkable economic growth and remarkable advance in social and economic indicators for the people of Latin America. To the extent that there's been a golden age in Latin America, it was from 1994 until 2024. Now that that is over, we just need to look to the previous eras to know which one is more likely. And what we learned from Venezuela is that the United States is not returning to the good neighbor policy. It is not acknowledging the sovereignty of other countries. It is in fact going back to that previous period of 1823 to 1933, where the United States acted in an openly imperial fashion, where it established its dominance and its right to intervene in any country in the Americas at any time that it wished over any issue. The Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine specifies, the new thing that it adds is that the United States reserves for itself the right to determine who gets to own or control strategic resources as defined by the United States in any country of the Americas at any time. And that is exactly what they then implemented in Venezuela. So the national security strategy, I think that we could look to Venezuela as the moment at which the stated intentions of the US government, as announced in this national security strategy of November 2025, are now fully in effect. What does it look like? Well, it is a return to quite a classical relationship between an imperial power and a colony, where there isn't an occupying force on the ground, so they're opting more for what is traditionally known as the British model of imperial control, of trying to work through a subordinate elite that will control the country to the benefit of the imperial capital. And that explains what we're starting to see in the economic realities in Venezuela, and the social realities, and in the security, where the United States is not so much controlling Venezuela, it is collaborating with the Chavista regime in a shared enterprise of dividing up the revenue from the sale of oil, which fits in perfectly into the Trump way of governing, which is to amass resources and then allocate them to in a patron-client relationship inside the United States. In that sense, even though the ideologies of MAGA and of Chavismo are fundamentally different, their methods for governing and the ends to which they govern are actually quite consonant with one another and fit in quite nicely. And there is actually shared interest between the Rodriguez regime and the Trump regime in their shared pilfering, essentially, of the resources of Venezuela. So really, the fact that it's such an overtly classical colonial approach, I think, offers some lessons for Canada. Again, in the theme of let's not be deceived about what we're dealing with the United States here. In my opening remarks, I'd referred to it as a dictatorship and an imperial power. I hope that was controversial. We can get into the dictatorship part afterwards, but my point here is that it's really quite a classic imperial power. Now, what does that mean for Canada? Well, Canada also has had many chapters of our relationship with the United States that we can look back on. I do notice that we have Bob Balfour on the back, so I do invite him to correct me on any of the oversimplifications I'm about to enter into. But when it comes to defending Canada's sovereignty, it has obviously been a central question, or John English, of course, is also invited to overrule me in any of my my statements here. The preponderant military power of the United States has been a reality since we've been a country in 1867. The original solution, of course, it's also in part why we became a confederation. The United Kingdom made a judgment in the 1860s that it was going to be prohibitively expensive to maintain to defend the territories of Canada from a rising power in the United States, particularly after its military. the military victory in the Civil War. And so the United Kingdom transferred political control to the colony of Canada and transformed us into a confederation precisely to offload the costs of defense. The newly autonomous government of Canada quickly calculated that that was going to be expensive for us as well. And so we signed the Brits signed a treaty with Washington in 1871 where we chose to disarm ourselves, to never represent a military threat to the United States. This is where the undefended border comes from. It doesn't come from the free trade era, it doesn't come even from the UN period, it comes from 1871. This is when we decided to make a bet that if we don't represent any kind of military threat to the United States, they won't threaten us militarily. Now, it's an article of faith of liberal internationalism, but this treaty was the handiwork of the great liberal leader of the United Kingdom, William Gladstone. It was classic liberalism, and it kept us free through a period from 1871 well into the 30s when the United States was still an imperialist power, acting in the way I described previously to countries of the Americas. So one takeaway from that is that Canada can live beside an imperialist dictatorship. It was arguably an imperialist democracy then, but we can live in that. We can defend ourselves by not defending ourselves. We have to make sure that we never represent a military threat to the United States in hopes that they then won't represent a military threat to us. I would argue the next period is also instructive for us, and that's in 1940, when Canada and the United States, under Prime Minister Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt, signed the Ogdensburg Agreement. It's a border between Ogdensburg, New York, and Canada. Can't remember what the Canadian town is, but anyway. What was this? Prescott, I think, yeah. It was signed in Ogdensburg. In Ogdensburg, Canada upped its ante from never representing a military threat to the United States. We agreed that no foreign military threat would ever be able to take advantage of Canadian territory to represent a threat to us. And in return, the United States agreed not to place military bases on Canadian territory. I think that the Ogdensburg deal can still stand if we make a commitment that no foreign military force could ever use Canadian territory or Canadian airspace or Canadian water space to represent a threat to the United States. We can make sure that the United States will never set a military base up on Canadian territory. That would be my conclusion of this brief oversimplification of Canadian-US history.
Well, thank you for that history, Ben, and where we stand today. I will, again, open it up for comments from the panel first and then from the rest of the participants. Does anybody on the panel have anything to comment on that? Any corrections, first of all, on Ben's history? I want to make sure that he had gotten it correct. I certainly couldn't correct it, Ben, so. And are there any...
follow-up is NORAD.
Use your...
There's a sequence here. Yeah. And NORAD became the ultimate defense of North America. So the future has to be built around the NORAD model.
Thank you for bringing us up to 1950, Charlie.
No, but Trump doesn't understand those things.
Yeah.
But the military do.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
And so, my view is that Canada somehow has to have the Bob Rays of the world speaking to the Fox News people. We've got other people like that, and I've said that to them, because Americans don't understand these issues. And Trump in his wild moods gives an appearance that he does, but he doesn't. But there's no point, articles in the New York Times. The Trump people don't read the New York Times. That's the problem. And they listen to Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, talk radio types of programs. And we've got to speak to those kinds of people. The other thing about water, for example, my brother was a twin brother, and I'm an only child, but my twin brother was Minister of Environment. A lot of these treaties, including Promasset Rain or whatever, involve the states and the governors with the provinces and the territories. And that is the trump card. That is a real strength of Canada, because we've got fantastic relationships among the provinces and the states. And we've got to build on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Those are really good points. I wanted to see if anyone else has any questions or comments. We're going to go to someone new first at the back of the room, and then we'll come back and over here. I also wanted to just say that the Honourable Bob Ray has entered, and I do believe that Charlie may have suggested that you go on the Rush Limbaugh show, but I'm not positive about this. So you can talk about him with him later. But do you want to bring the mic to the back of the room? Thank you.
My Canadian history is a bit rough, but I do think that Canadians look at their U.S. relations with a bit of a rosy-eyed view. My understanding is that up until 1939, the primary focus of U.S. military planning was an invasion of Canada in a situation where they found Britain occupied elsewhere, as they were in the War of 1812, and I believe it was War Plan Red. I was with you, Ben, when you were saying we have to look like we're prepared to walk away. My concern with Canadians, and this is a comment looking for a reaction from the audience and the panel, is are we too nice, too used to getting on with other people who are nice? Trump seems to be the kind of person who's learned to bargain the kinds of bazaars you'd find in Istanbul or in South Asia. He also looks like the kind of person who has kept the kinds of dogs you might have to keep in Jamaica or South Africa to guard your house, where the expectation is if you don't demonstrate power, you don't demonstrate a willingness, an unwillingness to bend the rules. The dog lives outside, it doesn't live on your couch, it doesn't sleep in your bed. Do Canadians have what it takes to bargain with this kind of a person who will say, if he expects to meet you halfway, he's going to ask you to back into a corner? Do we have the kind of will to walk away, to at least act as if we're going to walk away, to demonstrate that we're willing to bite back if he bites us? And I think that that's the kind of person that we're dealing with.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Very much. Thanks for the question. It is true that the United States had really quite open annexationist politics through this period that I'm describing from 1871, from the Treaty of Washington. Certainly up in the 1900s and 1910s, my understanding it was really quite overt. Somehow that liberal bargain held. The U.S. military, of course, has plans for the invasion of every single country in the world, and I think it's an important distinction when something remains in planning and doesn't get executed. This is an area where I definitely would have to turn to historians to ask why we were able to avoid any more overt attempt by the United States to annex us in this period of Teddy Roosevelt, where that annexationist was quite strong. On whether Canada has what it takes to bargain with Trump, I mean, I'm obviously calling for Canada to be strong enough by overtly developing an exit plan from CUSMA to demonstrate that we're willing to walk away from the deal. I think that would be the right thing to do, at least in political terms, if it's damaging in economic terms. But I do also have some evidence to suggest that we're holding our own. Look at the economic agreements that the Trump administration has negotiated with most liberal democracies since that quote-unquote Independence Day of April 2025. There are countries that are larger than us and that are, even if you look collectively, the European Union larger. I believe collectively the EU is a larger trading partner with the United States than we, and yet they caved. They accepted a terrible deal, 15% base tariff based on their anxieties about Russia. The United Kingdom secured a 10% tariff, still a worse deal than what we have, and of course that it has barely held up until now, because when the United Kingdom stood up for Greenland, Trump threatened to double it to 20%. The Japanese caved. I mean, country after country after country has caved. The Prime Minister has been under tremendous pressure to reach an agreement as well. And they've come close sometimes, and they have walked away. It's not just the Americans that have walked away from the deal. The Canadians have walked away from the deal. I'm not sure most of us on April 2nd would have predicted that Canada, there was a deadline of I think it was June 30th, and it was extended to August 1st or whatever. We went through those deadlines. We didn't accept a bad deal, and Prime Minister Carney has not yet paid a political price. So that gives me some hopes that we're going to be able to stand our own in the negotiation. The last thing I'd like to say is about Canadian niceness. I suppose that's always a perspective, who thinks we're nice. If we ask our First Nations, that might not be exactly the same perspective you get. I think that might be because there are obviously different forms that power takes. Power can be exercised through coercion, through cooperation, or through cooptation, is one sort of framing of it has. Canada has invested very heavily in securing the outcomes that we need for Canadians through cooperation, and we've been phenomenally successful at that. Witness, our successful security and prosperity these last 80 years. I think that's probably what gives rise to the fact that we're seen as nice. We are extremely good at building alliances with the United States. Witness the relationships with the states and with other domestic political actors. We actually get very far when we invest our power in cooperation. Now, we definitely need to be investing in the instruments of coercion as well, but I don't think niceness necessarily means weakness.
Thank you, Ben. And I know there's a lot of other comments and questions on this topic, but I have a large timer in front of me here that's counting down, and I do want to leave enough time for Charlie to also address some issues regarding Asia and broader issues about the business community. So, Charlie, I'd like to turn to you and to ask you in particular, as an Asian expert, is it realistic that Canada can persuade Asia to play a more robust part in our economic life? And are we walking a tightrope right now between the U.S. and China? So your thoughts on that?
Well, we're walking a tightrope between China and the United States. But Japan, if you look at Asia, starting with Japan, which is the most advanced country, you've got ASEAN, huge countries like Indonesia, 275 million people. India. When we were working on the free trade deal with the United States, and I've got all kinds of memos to the Prime Minister, Bernie, with Nakasone, set up direct meetings on an annual basis with the Prime Minister and both countries and the 4 top ministers, whatever. We haven't done that. Abe and Harper simply didn't get along. Harper, even on the European deal, which is really a Jean Charest, Roy McMurtry, not Roy McMurtry, the Liberal trade minister. Roy McLaren from PEI, distantly. Harper wouldn't go to Europe and see the different capitals and fight for it. And then Justin Trudeau finally got that European deal. We have to be much more engaged in Asia. But we have to be more engaged in Europe. I think the good thing about the Carney speech, it was a wake-up call for the world because he expressed clearly the rules-based system fostered by the United States is gone. And so these countries are waking up, and I think the Carney speech puts Canada in a very good position because we're closer to the United States as a country and an economy, and we have the wherewithal to explain, and I think the guy that understands that best in Europe is Macron, which is a nuclear and defense superpower, going back to de Gaulle. But we have to, the problem with Japan, they agreed in 1945, whether it was opposed by the Americans, that's a dispute, or opposed by the Japanese government and the emperor, to become a peace-loving, only for no spending on defense other than their own security. Now that's broken. Trump has broken that. They're even talking about becoming a nuclear power. And look at Germany. Germany is the same thing. Germany is now thinking of unheard of ideas about spending whatever.
But this all occurred in the last few weeks and months. And I think Canada is really well positioned if we get our act together. But that is my fear, that we're going to be too slow, too complacent. I don't think being popular, cooperative, all that is the issue. I think it's complacency. We're just not waking up to the fact that everything, the universities, the healthcare system, we've just got to get ahead of it. And, you know, 152 hospitals, most of them have e-records that are 1930s, all paperwork, and we're not in the digital world. Look at the banks. A lot of young people don't look at the Royal Bank or CIBC. How do they pay things? With Google.
Yeah, thank you. And you wanted to add something to this, Terry? Yeah.
I really do believe that what happened in Davos, not only with the Prime Minister's speech, with Macron's speech, with Ursula's speech, like I think that over the last 10 months, those people who've always believed in the rules-based order took a look at the world and took a look at the measure of one man and said, enough is enough. And I really believe that was a seminal change for all of us. I wish the Bretton Woods institutions had been able to reform over the last 15 or 20 years to recognize the rise of China, the role that Africa plays, the role of Asia. That's what they were all asking. It's one of the reasons that China got so dominant is because we didn't allow ourselves to understand the importance of recognizing what they were becoming to the world. But that's gone by the by. And now I think we're in a different frame of mind. And I do think that your notion, the complacency notion, Charlie, is really important. This is a time like no other, and there is no time for doing business at the status quo. It's going to need everybody putting everything on the table in a very different context. But that's what I believe was the fundamental role of that speech. He believes, Mark Carney believes in these institutions to his core. He watched over the Brexit issue where populism took rise and took an economic issue and put it into a ditch on disinformation and all the rest of it. He watched the financial crisis and tried to piece it back together. He did not take this time to enunciate that speech without clearly understanding the ramifications of it for us, but also for the world. And I think they coordinated it because I think they needed to issue a wake-up call to everybody.
Agreed. It was a real call to action. And I think that the idea, I was listening to Rutger Bregman recently on the Reef lectures from BBC, talking about the lack of moral courage. And I don't think it's, and I don't think it's just Canada. I mean, you look to the United States and what's happened with the institutions in the United States that have not stood up with moral courage and conviction. And I think it is a problem across, I would say, the elites, the leaders in North America and Europe as well, perhaps in Asia as well in some areas. So we do have another 9 minutes and 44 seconds. So I do want to turn it over back to the audience. And I know there was a question over here we weren't able to take last time, so perhaps you could come over here to the woman in the center. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Stacey Berry, and I'm the founder of Beesteller Group, a government relations firm. So one of the things that's a common theme is that we need to build Canada strong and we need labor. But there hasn't been enough emphasis, at least from the Prime Minister, in my opinion, addressing some bigger critical issues. So the BDC did a report in 2023 that says Canada has 100,000 less entrepreneurs than they did 20 years ago. 76% in the next 10 years of small business owners are going to be retiring with no succession plan. A lot of those companies could be bought up by U.S. private equity. And then we also have over 700,000 skilled trade workers getting ready to retire in 2028. So there's a lot of things that we could do here to really focus on attracting talent, retaining talent, investing in those critical issues so that we can be in a position to actually build a strong country. So just want to hear your thoughts on those issues.
Thank you very much. And I think that may be one thing that actually Trump has helped us with in some regards, that we're getting more of that talent in Canada right now. But any comments on that issue, Charlie?
From business school, I know exactly what you're talking about. Just give me an example. Paul Demery, who's one of the real intellectual leaders in the private sector, came from Ontario, Sudbury. He's a francophone. And contrary, was a big backer of federalism,
among French Canadians. He tried to buy the Royal Bank. The 5 banks with the Canada Bank Act, supported by the Senate, if you're the president, you're takeover proof. A weak performer like CIBC, and the banks control about 90% of savings, only the Royal Bank has a venture capital arm. BDC, which we saved, it's renamed, Paul Martin renamed it, the old FDRB. A lot of the MPs in the Maroney caucus wanted to kill it. And it's one of the biggest backers of venture capital. But it's a crown corporation. We set up a COA and Western diversification, because where the hell were the banks supporting startups? I mentioned the universities. If you're at Harvard or Wharton, as a student, you write a business plan to start a company, and 2/3 of the students at Harvard start a company as a student. Now, they may fail, but the good news about Silicon Valley, there's a tolerance for failure. If you fail in the United States, in Canada, you go bankrupt, the banks won't lend you money for your lifetime. It's like marijuana. You get caught with a 16-year-old with a jig of marijuana, you get a life sentence. We have to make these changes. And the banking system is a damn good place to start.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlie. And I don't disagree. In fact, I've been speaking to some young people in my role as MP and now looking to start businesses, and we just do not have the support network. You know, the government puts out programs, but they have all the qualifications, and if you don't fit into those buckets, there's very little place to go. And we stand to lose a lot of these brilliant young people and their ideas and their intellectual property to other countries. We have time for one last question. Yes? Over here? Hand up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you. Terry, I wanted to go back to you, and I apologize for reverting. I've got questions for all of you, but I'll pick on here the most recent one. In terms of what happened in Davos, I'm concerned about 2 things. One is that my recollection during the 90s was that Paul Martin took months to really build up a strong national consensus to moving through budget cuts, which were unheard of and would have been contemplated but ignored by Maroney prior to that. We brought it through because of a long, really conscious effort to build up a national consensus across party lines within all the business community right across the country. And you know some of that took time and it took place. And right now, we have a sort of soft national convention. Everybody's patting themselves on the back about Mr. Carney's speech. But in terms of sitting down and saying, let's get this thing done, let's stop arguing about pouring Crown Royal down the tubes. Let's stop talking about whether a medical practitioner can work in Alberta versus Ontario versus BC, or whether a nurse can work there. Nobody's sitting down and saying, let's get the goddamn thing done. And we haven't really got time to build up the consensus that Paul needed to get that through. So my real concern is, how do we get that urgency through this country so people really start talking about where we're going to go and accept the urgency that's there? So that's my one concern. The other concern is that when we start taking our sign out of the window internationally, we're the first one taking it out of the window, and I don't see any real support around the country for other people to take that sign out of the windows. If you look at the US, and our chairman's already mentioned that, you can see institution after institution, including the media and the universities, have all caved. All he's got to do is threaten a lawsuit of multi-billion dollars. He settles it without people willing to take the thing before the courts. Now, the courts down there are corrupt. I don't think anybody would say anything else other than that today. But, you know, in terms of our international situation, if we pull the first sign out of the window and others don't come down, we're really exposed. And are we prepared to take the risk inherent in that? And that includes, you know, defense costs and everything else that goes with that. But those are my 2 concerns based on what you raised.
Great questions. Let me take the reverse order. We woke up this morning and Donald Trump decided that because South Korea had not passed the free trade agreement in their legislature, that he was going to increase the retaliatory tariffs from 15 to 25%. Anybody who's worked in Asia know how horrible that is to treat that country like that and how humiliated they would be to be treated like that. He disgraced Switzerland in his speech in Davos. I think these countries are starting to say, what are we going to do? And I think they're looking for somebody to give them a path forward. I completely agree with you. I never thought in my lifetime I would have seen the capitulation that happened in the United States of America. But I'm not sure that that's the way it's going to go. I think there's a tide that's turning, and it may be slow, and it's going to hurt. It's going to really hurt, but I think it's going to happen. I don't think you can humiliate these countries internationally ad nauseum and not think you're going to get blowback. What he did this morning with that tweet, that just small little tweet, to prove Carney's speech right to the T, everything about it, right? And in Asia, that stuff really matters too. There was no need to do that to him. What you're telling me now, that you're going to tell us how our legislature is going to enact our laws? Come on. I mean, it's quite something. On the other issue, though, about the consensus that needs to build up, you're right. We don't have the time. I think that Paul Martin was able to do that because, one, he came from outside government, so he had the energy and the passion to devote in the first 2 years to he threw himself into that exercise to gain consent from Canadians because he knew, one, that he didn't want to fail, and he knew how important it was. And the business community was critical to that effort, absolutely critical. And we had real builders in the business community back in those days, quite frankly. And Ced Ritchie, Jimmy Pattison, Paul Desmarais, you had people that were willing to understand that they were going to take a hit, and we hit them, by the way, but they were going to build a consensus to try to right this wrong. We don't have the time to do it. I think the Prime Minister needs stronger people in Cabinet to enunciate that. I think we also need leaders in the business community, and we need leaders in academia. Because he's been honest. His forte is not in politics. His forte has been in negotiating crises and understanding the world as it is, as we see it. But yes, there's no doubt we have to move faster. He's got to build that consensus. But I also think the business community has to develop a different value proposition. It just can't be the way it was before. It now has to be about building Canadian entrepreneurs. It's got to be about building Canadian success stories. It's got to be about rebuilding our own supply chain within Canada. I would have thought the pandemic would have taught us that, but if nothing else, I think this next crisis will hopefully teach us that.
Thank you very much, Terry, and we're just about on time, so I'll turn it back over to you, Tom, and thank you very much to our panelists.
To the panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to break for lunch and to continue our discussions among each other and with the panelists, and then back by 12:15 to hear our keynote speaker. I also wanted to, I mentioned our partners already who have helped organize these events. I also want to have a shout out to Jansen Ing and David Spagamir and Al Pace and some others who I'll mention later who've also been a great support in helping us make this conference come together. So we're going to listen to Bob on the keynote, and then we have our second panel on national security and defense, because I did want to mention, Ben raised it with his quick tour of 19th century history, that yes, there was an imperialist aggressive power on our southern border, but we were protected by the British Navy. And so who in the 21st century is going to play that role to keep the eagle at bay? Anyway, lunch awaits, and let's continue the discussion. I guess we'll just leave it here with on the chairs.